all these people?
Well,
Aaron's
Amy was
here
worried,
from
but
Reedsport.
unnecessarily worried. All right, I
Okay,
am
good.
recording this session and we're going to go ahead and get started. It's straight up 4 p.m. and I want to be respectful
Okay.
of people's times. If people could begin to sign into the chat with your name and club, we'll get going and that'll help us take some attendance. And then, Chris, as our governor-elect, would love to recognize that you are here, but also as our governor. District Governor Nelson is with us. He's so
Hey,
lucky to have you. Yeah. And then we have lots of assistant governors and governors-elect in the room. So wave if you are one of those. Thank you. We appreciate having you here. Um, Chris, do you want to kick off? We've been talking about leadership forums, and these are kind of your areas. So just want to make sure if you wanted to say anything that you had the opportunity.
oh, thank you. The only thing I would like to say is that yes, I'm glad that we've got 11 people here at the moment. Oh, 16. Sorry, I'm looking at chats. Um, and before we close today, I would like to get some of your thoughts for future forums, because these forums are built around topics that are important to you to talk about. So between Amy and I and other dignitaries that we can rope into the process, we can we can talk about all manner of things that you're facing as leaders and try to help you through them. So that's all I have
And
to say.
thanks, Chris. We do have a list going of topics and a couple that are coming up, but I would love to hear feedback and input for future topics. Um, so let's just jump in. And folks who are just joining us, if you wouldn't mind signing into the chat with your name and your club to let folks know who's here with us. We really appreciate it. And I will do my best to monitor the chat once we get going. There are a lot of
I can
screens
help.
open. Thank you. My screens are full, so if I'm missing somebody who has a question, please feel free to go ahead and interrupt me. Chris will help, and we ask that you take good care of yourselves during this presentation. So, if you need to take a break or turn your screen off, you're welcome to do that. And like I said, this is meant to be an interactive. There will be some very key places for you to participate, but there may be opportunities for you that I wasn't even expecting. So we just have an hour, but I think that the topic is fairly broad. But the idea behind it is really to help you as leaders navigate difficult conversations that come up in Rotary. Some call this conflict resolution, some can call it conflict prevention. But regardless of how you think about it, it really is about communication at its heart. So let's just jump in. So, crucial conversations. What are they? And this is an opportunity for you to popcorn in what you think they might be.
Can
Anybody
we
have a
talk or
thought?
you want us to chat?
Yeah, absolutely. Popcorn in. That's
Okay.
what that means.
All right. I
Sorry.
was just going
Thanks,
to say
Valerie.
one of the ones is when somebody brings something up, because we've had this happen, which is very political.
Okay.
Um, so how to tactfully try to get that person to understand that that probably was not an appropriate thing to do.
Right. We're going to talk about challenging conversations and lots of scenarios. That might be timing, that might be location, they might be conversations that are perfectly appropriate outside of a Rotary venue, but not necessarily appropriate for us to talk about when we are in Rotary. And that's difficult given the society we live in and how we navigate that in Rotary. So I think that's a great point, Valerie. Others?
I hope we will all keep in mind not only the difficult and sometimes tension producing conversations, but I think it's also crucial that we don't forget to have positive conversations when the opportunity arises during our club meetings or board meetings or whenever it is. For instance, when we need to recognize a non-Rotarian perhaps at a club meeting for their contribution to a club event.
Great point, Joe. Don't forget to say the important things, to recognize people, to say the positive things. My mentor always said you could never thank people too much. And I think that's a wise way to live life. So, yeah, crucial conversations also include positive things. They're not always conflict based. Other people.
Suggestions to make changes in the club, changes in meetings. Could be positive or negative.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Mike. It could be a positive or a negative thing. And change can be hard, but it can also be really great and useful. And sometimes walking through hard things together, we end up on a better path. Anyone else have anything they want to add? Well, I just want to say that even in Rotary, where we all are committed to the greater good, to serving our world and each other, and being leaders in our communities and in the world, we have conflict. And in fact, the more involved in leadership you get, the more often you find it, because it's where people bring their conflict is to their leaders to ask for support or guidance or feedback. And so, I think it's an essential element of helping us have healthy, dynamic, effective, collaborative teams. And I actually think conflict is not something that we should always view as negative. I think it's one of my favorite things about Rotary is that it brings people with great diversity of thinking together and unites them in service. And so I love that I sit in rooms with people who think differently about many of the same things in other capacities. And so, I can sit at a table with people who voted differently than I did, and we can still find common ground with where we can do this great work together. So if we kind of remember at the heart of it, this is how we maybe influence each other, and maybe it's how we help each other, and maybe it's how we do this great work is by having these crucial conversations. I think it will serve us well. Why does it matter? I think we really jumped into that, and I wanted to just really define conflict resolution, because I think most of the strategies we use for managing crucial conversations are brought in conflict resolution framework. And so I share this with you from my professional background. I work as a facilitator and educator within the human service population. We host a national center at my agency called Cadre, which is the National Conflict Resolution Center for Dispute Resolution in Special Education. And we train mediators and hearings officers and folks who are charged with helping schools and families work out very complex issues. I also have a group of folks who are facilitators for a wraparound process, which means they host big teams of people who are all invested in seeing families and their kids succeed across many systems that serve them. And so they're often dealing with very complex issues from groups who have very distinct mandates and financial stakeholder relationships to the conflict. And so they can be very difficult and very positive conversations. And so spending a lot of time thinking about how we can proactively help people be effective communicators is a big piece of what we do. The other piece is when they disagree, coming up with strategies to help them figure that out. So applying that to a Rotary Club and into our personal lives can be very similar. It can also be very different. And so what I'm hoping that you all will help me do is think about the ways that these strategies I'm sharing with you impact you and your clubs. So I'll start off with sort of sharing some of them and then opening it up for discussion. And then we have some opportunity maybe to talk about a scenario from each or a few of you, depending on how much time we have. Does that sound like a good plan? Thumbs up if you think so. All right, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs. So let's jump in. Let's talk about styles of conflict. So in the most simplest of terms, we have different types of conflict. We have interpersonal conflict. typically between two people, and it can be a communication breakdown or it can be a personality difference. We also have task-related conflict, and this can be a conflict that's based, or a difference that's based in how we approach a task, or what the task might be, or the goal of the task. This is one that happens often in Rotary, where we're not in alignment, or if we don't have a clear picture of what the objective is, where you can find these breakdowns in communication can really flourish. And they can build into these big, ugly, hairy problems when they really could have been avoided by really good, effective communication early on. In most cases in our work, we see a lot of that, where it was a breakdown in communication early in the process that led people to these paths of great conflict. And now we've escalated and escalated and escalated to whoever has the most power then can shut down the conflict. And that leaves people feeling very disconnected and very frustrated, and often can create permanent resentments and breakdowns in relationship. And then we have value-based, and somebody sort of brought up the political thing that's kind of impacting many of our clubs. And this is really comes down to a lot of values-based conflict. And this is disagreement over values or principles. Political affiliations can often fall into those categories. So those are our three basic types of conflict. Does anybody want to think about how one of those areas, or share with us how one of those areas of conflict, briefly, please, has impacted you as a leader in Rotary?
This is Carol.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. We had a fundraising committee, and there was an individual. So this is kind of like interpersonal and task related, where an individual wouldn't show up all the time. And then when they would come back to the committee, they wanted to change everything that had been decided before then. When the person didn't get their way, they just went and like hired people that the committee didn't want hired. And so it was quite the challenge with dealing with the interpersonal. And also, we already had the task set, but you circumvented it to do something different.
That does sound difficult. We may come back to you to talk about if there was a resolution, what that looked like, Carol. So hold on to that. Anyone else have a quick example they might want to share?
I would say that the biggest thing that we've had is trying to get people involved in the progression of leadership in the club.
Oh, okay.
We've talked to 3 people who were what we felt were primed to be vice president, and all 3 have turned us down, saying they just don't want to be involved in what they considered what was the word? An upper echelon that only cared about themselves. And so that really reflects badly on what we're doing. So hopefully that we can change that. Something I have not seen or felt, but there are some people that have those feelings. And how do we get past that?
Sure. Paul, that's a really interesting that you bring that up, because I've been thinking that it might be time for us to do some strategic work around how we develop our leadership within our clubs, and that it might be time for a listening session between leadership and membership forums to combine and hear what's happening, because we're hearing a lot of clubs struggle with identifying or getting folks to accept the next leadership position. And I wish that it could be like a competition where we're so excited to become the leaders of our clubs that people are clamoring over who gets to be the next president, instead of sort of this idea that you missed a meeting and now you're club president. And I hear that sometimes when we're at president-elect training, and I just am sad, because I want people to feel as excited and privileged to be the leaders of their clubs as possible. So I want to put a pin in that for something that we come back to. But I do think that hearing what you said when you described it was that you were hearing some of the unmet need in that. I think he also gave us a strategy, sort of, if you listen to what he was describing, not only was he describing a problem, but a strategy for maybe addressing it. See if you can hear it as we talk throughout today's session. So let's talk about some resolution styles. There are several, but I'm going to give you some basics. So many people are very good at this. They find conflict punishing and don't see it as a positive. And just the mention that in a leadership position, you might have to address conflict can send people running for the hills. And so many people just choose to ignore the issue and maybe it'll resolve itself on its own. You know, listening to your kids fight in the next room, maybe I'll just walk down the hall and they'll work it out. How often is that successful? It's a gamble, right? It might work sometimes. Sometimes people do have a way of slugging it out or hugging it out, however they handle conflict. But most often, avoiding the problem just makes the problem grow bigger. We also have folks who are very accommodating and they may just give in. It's easier to just say yes than to push for what you want. And we all know that that doesn't last very long either, that many people will become embittered or no longer show up when they feel like they're always accommodating someone else. And so they vote by their absence, right? So that's another style. We also have competing, which is sort of kind of reminds me a little bit of what Carol was saying, where we just start doing our own thing in competition with what everyone else is doing because we're not working together. And it could be, you know, in any way that you're actively pursuing your own agenda at the expense of someone else, it becomes a competing issue. So something for us to think about as a style. Many people use compromising style, which is our next one. And this often can look like maybe conflict resolution and can be very positive, but it can also sometimes mean that there's a loss for other people. So sometimes the most effective strategy can also come with a cost, and we need to bear that in mind. But often finding middle ground is a great way to resolve a conflict. This is my favorite, which is collaborating, and it's working together to find the win-win solution so that everybody feels they win. Even if they're compromising a bit, they still feel like they win. That feels better than just like cutting the baby in half. And so one of the things we talk about when we train new facilitators is interest-based negotiation. And we try to help people separate positions from interests. And I like to talk about how that's different. That's this distinguishing thing between compromising and collaborating. And if we could get down to what your interest is versus your position, then maybe we could find a way to get to a collaborative result rather than a compromise. And so, for example, this might look like the age-old example of two siblings are fighting over an orange, and their parent comes in and says, fine, I'll slice the orange in half, and you can have half, and you can have half. And that was just a compromise. But if they had really gotten to the heart of what they needed and unpacked the interests of each of the siblings, they would have learned that one sibling wanted the peel to use in a zest for a recipe, and the other one wanted the meat to make a juice. And so if they had gotten to their interests, they would have been able to take the peel and give it to one and give the meat of the orange to the other, and we could have had a win-win. And do you see the difference between the two? Thumbs up if you get what I'm saying. It's much easier in that example than it can be in real life to unpack. But one of the strategies we use to help people unpack is to say more about that. Teach me why you're thinking that and get to the why. And we try to ask why, not just with the word why, but really ask questions that get to the why several times. And one of our rules for new facilitators is, have you asked why 3 times when there's somebody who's locked into a position? Because, and we don't want them, like I said, we don't want them to just go, why, because that can be really annoying and off-putting. We want them to ask why in a really creative way 3 different times when someone's locked in, so that they can really get to the heart of what someone's interest is and not just their position. So a special ed example I can offer you is a student needs speech language services, and they're offered once a month, but the family really wants that child to have better communication. And so they're saying, I want speech and language services every day. And the school is saying, nope, once a month, that's good enough. But that's not good enough if the parent really wants improved communication. So if we can get to the idea of, I really want improved communication and not just speech and language services, then the school could then answer, well, these are the other ways that we help improve communication. It's not just through this push-in service. There's all these other ways, and that might help address the parents' concerns. So you have to get to the heart of it and not just the position. Does that make sense? Can someone think of a Rotary-based example?
I think the issue that came up earlier about meeting times and days and things like that, it seems to be very contentious in some clubs, and it has been in ours in the past. And I'm not sure that the people asked why we were making the change or how we came to think of this specific change. They just lashed out in the middle of a meeting when we had guests and stuff. So it
Yeah.
became very, very contentious instead of asking the why.
Yeah, asking the why is a great thing, and that is an example that where I think there's several different interventions we're going to talk about that could have been employed for your example, Carol. So we'll talk more. I also think about my own club when we stopped taking attendance, for example, and there were people who were really upset about that. And then we had discussions about why we should be taking attendance, and people who were very adamant about the flexibility in membership that was so important to them being a need, and then people who were so used to having a perfect attendance had a need. And so when you could really unpack those needs, you could figure out a way that we could take attendance but not make it required, and it would still be meaningful to people who valued that 100% attendance and been doing it for years, and then people who wanted flexibility. So sometimes if you just ask more questions, you quickly can discover the conflict. That's a very simple explanation for a bigger problem. When you think about Carol's situation, that's a very complex issue. And there are, like I said, lots of strategies. So let's jump into some of our strategies or techniques. So the first is listening. And many people talk about listening, and all of us think we're good listeners, but active listening is a strategy where you are participating in a different way. And I'd like to tell you, and I wish to tell you that it wasn't true for me, but many of us, when we're listening, are actually thinking more than we're listening. And we're thinking about how we're going to respond if we're fully engaged in the conflict. Sometimes we're not fully engaged and we're thinking about outside, completely unrelated things. And so being a very present and mindful listener and participating in active listening means we're actually there to hear what people have to say, and really trying to get to a place of understanding. So we're looking for the interest, we're looking for an unmet need, we're looking for the areas of agreement, and it needs to take all your focus to do all those things. And so if we're being very good listeners, we're doing that. It also can slow your communication down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because before you're responding, you're pausing to then think about your response. So do you see how that could really take the level of conflict down, because you're giving yourself time to really listen, then you're giving yourself time to think before you respond, which are great de-escalation strategies also. Sorry, I bumped it. We also need to practice empathy. And I'm going to show you a quick video because I just love Brene Brown. And I mean, so many people do, but she does a really good job of showing us about what empathy looks like. So hopefully you can see this. Can you all see it? Okay, here we go.
I don't hear it, Amy.
Right.
Can you not hear it?
No, the sound's not on.
Is that true for everybody?
Right.
Because we tested it earlier.
Yes.
I think when you play it, you have to click something that says play with the sound. You probably know,
Okay,
but
hold on.
like turn it off and turn it back on.
Okay, give me 1 second.
Because the sound is, this is a great video.
It is a great video, and we did test it. Share computer sound. Here we go. Let's see if that works.
I'm stuck. It's dark.
Did people hear that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Sorry, guys.
So, what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right, folks, what do you think of that?
Want a sandwich?
I love when the goat sort of rolls its own eyes. But do you understand the purpose behind, if you think about active listening and empathy? Are you seeing the PowerPoint? You are not seeing the PowerPoint, are you?
Nice
See
screenshot,
forest.
though. Yeah, it's a
I'm
nice
seeing
forest.
You're seeing my desktop. Okay, let's get it back up there for you. And we will. Thank you for bearing with me.
I can see the forest for the trees, or the trees for the forest, whichever.
There we go. Resolution techniques. All right. So we need to practice empathy in our active listening practice. I just think that those two are so interconnected. When you're thinking about someone who's describing something that's difficult or that has created conflict, approaching that with an at least or sympathetic sort of attitude is dismissive sometimes and really doesn't help de-escalate the situation. It also it isn't an evidence you're good listening, right? So if someone really is feeling heard because you're listening really intently and you're very present in that conversation, and then you're showing them empathy, they will feel it. And if you have been in a situation where someone has done that for you, you know it. And if someone is being sympathetic, often people will describe feeling dismissed. And so these two just go hand in hand. And if you're listening for understanding, it's easier to access your own empathy because you're listening for what the unmet need is, or what the unresolved tension is, or what they're experiencing. And you're not thinking about your own position yet. You're thinking about theirs. Does that make sense? Another technique that we can apply is really managing our own frame of mind. And I use this whole description much bigger than typically I see it, because people will start talking about being calm and centered and keeping themselves from responding to the conflict with their own passion. And it's a really hard, it's a difficult thing to manage your own emotions in a high conflict situation, especially if you have a vested interest in the outcome or what's happening or a relationship that's at stake. And so I just talk about it as frame of mind. And so if I go into this with, I need to be heard, I need to be right, I want what I want, it's very different than if I come into a situation with, I want to understand what the breakdown in communication is. I want to understand why this isn't working. I want to see us work together rather than get my own agenda or my own needs met. So your frame of mind is really impactful on how you have these crucial conversations. And I often teach people about their brains going offline. And earlier, when I talked about that power dynamic, when people are engaged in high stress and their frontal lobes have shut down and they're just responding with their lizard brain or their animal brain, that's when you get these big conflicts, and it takes the person with the most power to shut it down. And people end up often having great levels of disconnect, which doesn't help resolve conflict or move things forward in any way. And then you kind of heard this in throughout this discussion about seeking common ground. And I think when you are starting at a place where people are in disagreement, finding what they agree upon first and building on that. So, if we don't necessarily agree about how we're going to do something, but we do agree on the what it is that we want to do, that's a good place to start. And then entertaining all the different ways we might do it might help us get there. So what do you already agree upon? What are you all on the same page about? Listening for understanding will help you get that as well. This one can be tricky for people, but if you focus on you and not other people by using I statements, then it's much more about your needs and your interests when you're in conflict rather than pointing at other people and saying you. And this is really hard in interpersonal relationships for people to practice. But if I feel dismissed and frustrated when someone is talking over me, then that's a great way for me to start off a conversation by, Chris never lets me talk. And, she's always interrupting me. She doesn't think I matter. You hear the difference in how I can describe that? And immediately when I say, Chris never lets me talk, Chris is immediately going to say, I can't get Amy to shut up. So, she's going to get defensive. So if I said, I just feel like every time I raise my hand in this room, no one calls on me. That's a way to start making it about me and what my unmet need is. And then I'm feeling unheard. And then it's up to the group to respond with how they can help me feel heard or remind me of the ways that I have available to me to help me feel heard, as an example. So try to use I statements, focus on your actions. They're the only ones you can control, and see if that might help you find the common ground. And then your last technique might be to bring somebody in. Bring somebody in who doesn't have a vested interest in the outcome. And in Rotary, we have a lot of support starting with our assistant governors and then up the line to help you resolve conflicts within your club. And there may be folks within your own club who are very skilled at this to help your leadership. So you might look internally first before you start bringing external folks in. But sometimes that doesn't work because maybe they do have a vested interest in the outcome, or they have a vested interest in the players, and it might be difficult for them to be objective, or they have experiences that might prevent them from being objective. You know, if you know that every time you interact with somebody you have conflict, then maybe you aren't the person to mediate that conflict with somebody else. So looking for help, bringing someone in is really a great strategy. It also helps us make sure we're being equitable when we have somebody's outside perspective. I also benefit from hearing from what other people in other clubs have experienced or done when they've had those issues. And so sometimes just even processing it out loud with somebody from a different group can help you sort of understand what your other options might be. You know, that's the person who's been in the hole before and knows where the light switch is. It's really useful. All right, so I have a scenario that I can share with you, or we could start with Carol's scenario that she shared. So maybe let's do that. Carol, would you reshare the example of your fundraising group again, and then we'll let folks weigh in thinking about it from some of these techniques?
Thank you. So it was a committee that was planning an event. And one individual is a very strong individual, which I didn't say before, and they have very strong views about certain things. And the person wasn't there when we were planning a specific segment of the event. When the person came back, she basically told the committee that what they had planned wasn't good enough. And when we did not, quote unquote, listen to her, then she went and hired somebody to do the thing that she thought needed to be done, and paid for it themselves. However, it was against what the committee felt was appropriate for this event.
All right, thanks, Carol. So thinking about that example, does anybody have a strategy that they might use if that situation was happening in their club? Mike, I see your hand.
Well, I guess I would start with, well, hopefully before this person walked out the door, would try to engage in some questions about, why does she think this other strategy works better? What does she think the club is going to achieve by going that route? What are the pros and the cons of that? Why is she thinking that it's better to go with this other organization she evidently was going with? And I guess, show some empathy, I guess, if that can be done. If she's saying my way or the highway, I know that's got to be difficult to stop her at that point. But I guess questioning might take it in a different direction that might be more positive.
Thanks for that. Anybody else have another strategy they might use? Are there any Ted Lasso fans? It's one of my favorite shows, and there's a scene in there, and I think I shared it when we were talking about equity and diversity one time, about being curious instead of judgmental. And I'm very curious about were there barriers that kept that person from being at that meeting, so that they walked in to another meeting already feeling like they were being left out, like walking it back clear to the beginning, like what curiosity about what happened there. I'm also curious about why they felt like they could just hire somebody to do it without kind of club consensus. Is there a history of them sort of feeling like they're on their own and now they feel like they just have to do that again? There's a lot of questions I would want to ask. Anybody else?
I was just going to say, I think it's really important to bring it back to the common interest. You both want this event to happen. So let's take a look at, backtrack a little bit and say, okay, let's take a look at the event and then do the questioning. Why does this seem like it would be better than that? I guess that's what I would probably do.
Good strategy. Joe, I saw your hand. Are you going to add something?
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea how to go about this. Hope to hear some ideas. But it seems like the person who is going off on their own has a different set of expectations about how decisions are going to be made and implemented within that group. And enlighten me, Amy. How do you get that conversation onto that topic without putting that person on edge?
Well, it's really hard. So once you're that far down, you've already got some things that have exploded. So you're already having to do repair. And so while it's much easier to talk about what to do before that happens, and so that's where we're focusing a lot more on today. But we might get Carol to tell us some more of what happened. But somebody's going to lose some face in this conversation because they've already done some things that are against the group. And so you're going to have to walk it back and work on repair. But I think sometimes if you approach it with that, instead of like, I'm angry that you went ahead and did this, like walk it back from how do we get back to where we're working to a team, acknowledging that clearly they really care and they're super passionate. If they felt like they needed to put maybe their own resources into paying somebody, I mean, I don't know, I don't have all the facts, so I'm sort of guessing, but maybe they put their own resources into it. And so you might acknowledge like, wow, you really care about this and really are interested in having this be successful, but so is this other group. And I wonder if there's a way that we might do that together. And can we talk more about that? Tim, I see your hand. What were you going to
Yeah,
say?
I think, and it was kind of what you just said, Amy, but I think in this situation, there's a bit of a fairness at play here too, because this person has not been coming all along to these different sessions, and all of a sudden comes in and has their own solution where the other group has already worked towards a group solution. So I think there needs to be a sharing of why and how the group came up with what they came up with, rather than
Yep.
her coming in or him coming in and dictating that theirs was the only solution possible, especially since they hadn't been there all along.
And sometimes when it's in this big of a problem and you've kind of got this big where there's, casualties or wounds that have been created because we've already gotten this far down the road, you may have to bring somebody in who can help you do that because maybe they can't hear it from that committee. Maybe they're disregarding the committee. Maybe you need an authority figure to get kind of come back in and remind them of the equity. But how they do that could be the difference between that person taking their toys and leaving or staying and playing. And so that's where I think I would focus as a leader. If this were my club, I would think about how we might bring them back together and still keep them invested and participating. But sometimes you do have to say the hard thing of you went beyond, you knew this was a committee and maybe they didn't include you very well, or maybe they didn't address the barrier of why you couldn't be there. And I'm not saying that, Carol, so please don't be offended. But
No.
maybe that's how they felt. And so maybe acknowledging that the committee made some mistakes and maybe this individual made some mistakes and we can both walk it back to working together. But you all kind of illustrate when you see the problems, some of the potential solutions for proactively avoiding those situations. One is coming up with some ground rules and some agreements and having shared agreements about how committees going to function and how decisions are made and who has decision-making authority and what to do when we disagree with that. Because it can happen and it's okay. Sometimes disagreements help us get to the next level. So to not be afraid of that, but to be in the beginning of it, having a conversation about what to do when we disagree really helps it when it happens. And often people think, oh, that's not us. These disagreements never happen until they do, and then they're big, and then they're destructive. So an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure, right? Anybody else have comments or thoughts? George, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Amy, you were just touched upon this, and I don't know how it fits in a volunteer world like it does in when I was working in industry, but for a lot of decision making of any kind of significance, we used a tool called a RACI model. And
Okay.
it really explained what your role is. Are you responsible for the decision? Are you consulted? Maybe your role is just being informed. You're not the decision maker. And understanding your role was very helpful because, I'm an opinionated person. But if you define a role and say, hey, George, I know you got a lot of opinions, but in this case, you're just a weigh-in person. It's not your call. And you knew that going in. So again, I don't know how it fits or, that's a great model that applies to maybe bigger decisions, not everyday things. But as I think you use the term like understanding your role and the decision-making process.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. In a volunteer organization, that is a much harder because we almost all are on the same playing field when we're in a committee, right? And sometimes we have a chair, sometimes we have some effective leaders, but sometimes the most um, strength comes from folks who are not in a leadership position. And sometimes we have difficulty with those kind of behind the scenes leaders who are not in the front, for example. And sometimes like a shadow leader will emerge who's working things behind the scenes, and that can cause just as much conflict as somebody who's actively disregarding somebody else. So it is more difficult in a volunteer organization, but I think it's still possible. And I think to be clear is to be kind. So being really clear about what our process is and how we're going to manage it, and when it's not working, what we're going to do, and then have those be things that everybody agrees to, so that when this happens, we can remind them, remember, Amy, this is the thing you agreed to. When you disagreed, you weren't going to go behind the committee and straight to the president. You were going to come back to the committee and share that, and we were going to work through it. And when we couldn't find agreement, we were then going to take it to the club board or whatever, right? Chris, did I see your hand up?
You did, because I wanted RACEY, RACEY. So I spelled it out and Googled it. It's RACI. It stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And I'm going to have to look more deeply into that, George. Thanks for bringing it up. It wasn't a term that I was familiar with.
It was very helpful. Once again, in the private world, it was very helpful. You knew your role. And that the important part is, once a decision was made, and this could apply to volunteers, once a decision is made, the group all agrees to support it. Even if it wasn't what you wanted, you need to walk in lockstep. So that's really important that everybody understand that.
So then say responsible in this case could be a person or it could be a committee, correct? Or
I'd have to look, I think, because in the RACI model, you can have a bunch of people who are consulted, a bunch of people are informed, but I think ultimately you have one person who's responsible. It's like when you sign an action item. If you give it to 5 people, is it going to get done or not? You give it to one person, and maybe they get a team of people, but the more people you assign it to, less likely it'll happen.
Well,
and
thank
so
you.
Maybe that translates better to tasks than it does to the actual individuals when you're in a committee structure like Rotary. You could think about it like that. But often I see bigger problems with people not being given tasks, and then tasks just like being left out there. People know it needs to get done, but nobody was assigned because nobody was taking a leadership role. That seems to be where things get stuck a lot in committees. And so that clarity, like, these are the things we all agree about. And if you are not someone who's strong at facilitating that and you're the committee chair, maybe you find someone who is strong at facilitating that and coming up with a clear action plan. We're talking about action plans all the time in Rotary, because they are an effective way to make things happen and get to those end results that are so important to us. And so they need to be smart, right? They need to be, specific, manageable, if you spell out SMART, I can't remember all the acronyms of SMART off the top. I'm blanking. I'm having those semi-senior moments, but if you look up SMART goals or SMARTY goals, those are the things that we need to make sure we're doing when we're creating plans. And it's okay to make somebody who is a really good task manager part of your group so they can help hold you through those processes. But you have to facilitate, as a leader of a group, the process by which you resolve conflict and disagreement, and welcome it. Like, start from the beginning with the idea that there may be differences in thinking because you have such a diverse group of people in your groups who think so differently. And then we come up with a plan for how we handle it when it happens. Thoughts about that? Thank you. Keeper's got my back. SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-oriented. And then we've added these IE to it for SMARTY, which I is for inclusive and E is for equitable, so that when we're making these decisions, we're thinking about the greater group and the fairness in our decision making. And if you think about the very description of what was happening in Carol's scenario, these things probably didn't feel that way to a lot of people. Is that fair to say?
No.
No,
All
Sorry.
right.
no.
Let's go back
that's
to our
not-
PowerPoint.
Yes, it was a power play.
All right, so before we turn it over to questions, I just have some key points that I wanted to wrap us up with. Conflict is inevitable, but it can be resolved constructively. Leaders have to practice their skill. We don't call it a practice for nothing. You know, it's my favorite piece of advice from somebody was, it's not it's not brain surgery. You won't kill the patient. You get to try again tomorrow. So keep trying, keep practicing your skills. Don't be afraid to say, you know, I don't like how that worked out. Can I try it a different way? That will help. And the power of apology could be a whole seminar. We could spend a lot of time talking about the power of apology, but it can be a very, very important factor in reconnection and repair when someone takes ownership of something, even if you didn't intend. We can talk about impact versus intent. And my intent wasn't to cause harm, but my actions still caused harm to somebody. I can still apologize for that in a way that's really meaningful. It doesn't have to be, I'm sorry, you're mad, because that does feel dismissive of their feelings, right? And so that can be a useful strategy. Keep practicing, don't give up, try again. Sometimes by the very nature of saying, can I try that again? Someone is going to feel appreciation for your willingness to show up and do a hard thing or have a hard conversation. And remember your shared objectives and common ground. Someone earlier brought up the idea of the political stuff that's happening. And I think Rotary gives us pretty clear guidance that we're a non-political organization and that we have to ground ourselves in the things that bring us together. And so if these issues come up, I think that's where you have to camp out. And we're going to have to talk about them one by one, because whether or not somebody is an appropriate speaker for your club, whether, you know, those issues do come up, and it's okay to ask for help for that. And I feel like Rotary's given us a lot of support in navigating these. When I was governor, these issues were coming up. They're not new. So people are being trained and given support to help you navigate those. So don't feel like you're alone. They happen to all of us. And just remember, we have to try and separate ourselves from that and remember who people are because they're Rotarians and the values that they bring to Rotary. And is it the four-way test is really what it's about? Is it fair to all concerned? You know, remember those things when those things come up. And I'll open it up to you for questions. This is my cute little grandgirl and grandpup who celebrated their first birthday this weekend.
Clean up the poop.
Uh-oh, somebody's unmuted. Any questions or thoughts? Valerie, I see your hand.
Yeah, raising my hand. I'm not really down on the. It's been a while since I've been in a Zoom meeting, so I forgot about how to raise my hand. But I just wanted to appreciate. I mean, I've seen a lot of what I'm coming forth with, because I kind of feel like I still feel somewhat new to the club, because the club has been established and there's a lot of older, you know, people that have been there doing these projects for a long time. And so a couple times I've kind of semi jumped in without jumping in enough. And so this has given me, we had an incident where we were doing a service project in the meeting. You know, I felt that the person who's been running it for 5 years knew what she was doing. And so I just kind of sat back and let it happen. And then things didn't get assigned. And so I had to apologize because I had kind of inferred that I would do it. So it's given me the impetus to realize that you really do need to just step forward and make sure that you're doing it, taking something on and vocalizing it. That SMART goal thing really hit home with me. So I do appreciate a reminder of how important that is. In if you're going to step up and volunteer to do something, that you do the whole 9 yards and you make yourself heard. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome, and I agree with you so much. I also encourage people to make sure that we have agreement about what the thing I'm agreeing to is, and what does that look like? Because sometimes the conflict comes from unclear expectations. If I think it looks like this and you think it looks like that, and we didn't do a good job communicating, we're both going to be disappointed or dissatisfied with the outcome. I'm going to feel managed. You're going to feel let down. Things like that can happen really easily. So, that curiosity and that clarity are key in making sure when you're stepping forward. But you step forward and then just ask the questions, right? Anybody else? All right. Well, you're all conflict experts and ready to go resolve all the problems in your clubs, right?
Oh, Amy.
Yes, Laura. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Amy.
Laura's from my club. She's awesome.
Well, thank you. With Carol's situation, the one that we discussed, sometimes it's just so messed up, and there isn't a whole lot of empathy or listening, sometimes it's just messed up and somebody is intransigent and they only have one way to do things. And I think that's a huge issue, because I think I heard the word power grab. Well, then what happens is now we have a serious problem, because this person is going to have to be told, no, you have to get your money back, or we don't know what you're going to do, but no, that is not what is going to happen. And boy, I think that's much more complicated than, 'cause sometimes people do shit. Sorry, just to put it out there.
No,
That's
no,
how
you're
it
not
is.
wrong.
And then what do we do?
The hard part for that, for me, is that I think, and I've been trained that if it's not a strength, it's an unmet need. And so something that's happening in that situation has created an unmet need for that person, that they feel that they need to grab that power, or that they have an unresolved need. And so not knowing the situation, not knowing them, makes it really hard to speak to that.
Right.
But
Right.
I think you're right. There has to be the hard conversation. That's what I'm talking about. Why it's really hard when there's a situation like this that creates problems. Like there's casualties, and sometimes that casualty is that person, and sometimes you're going to lose people because they're just so
Right.
entrenched they can't hear the no. And so trying to prevent that from happening and have that agreement ahead of time is probably the best strategy. But when it happens,
Absolutely.
we have to
Absolutely.
walk through it in kindness. We have to walk through it in compassion and realize that there's something happening there. And then if they don't participate in it with you in the same way, they're giving you their information and their vote, and you have to say, what do we say? Bless and release. Maybe it's not a good fit. Maybe there are other options. Maybe we could try that scenario that you're suggesting another way. Look for other ways rather than just splitting the baby in half or the orange in half. What is the unmet need that's not getting met? And maybe they need another thing to be in charge of if it's not that thing anymore. Maybe there's another opportunity for them. There's a lot of different options. It's just really hard to talk about a specific scenario where it's so entrenched. But I think what you're saying, Laura, is that sometimes there is just shit, and you have to wade through it and be willing to.
That is because you can be your best therapist ever, and it's not going to change the dynamic.
Or maybe not yet. That's the other thing, is that it may
Well,
not change right yet, but the only constant in the world is change. Maybe it's not us who's going to change it. So maybe when we bless and
yeah,
release, change will
So-
happen because of that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, we will certainly have a better committee next time
Maybe.
because of this.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll
well,
definitely learn from it. Let's hope.
Absolutely.
Joe, I see your hand.
Yeah, I think this is an outstanding topic, and surely it would take an hour by itself. So I'd like to strongly suggest that perhaps as a future topic, having difficult conversations with bullies might be a good topic because we sometimes have to cross that bridge or deal with those. That is a fact of life.
Mike, yeah.
Well, Amy, I agree with everything you were saying there about how to try to deal with the conflict in that way. But I guess, and I think Joe kind of touched on this, is that you also have to balance the interests of the club or the committee. So, like, if I understood the situation to begin with, this person went off and tried to set up an event on her own. At some point, you could go through all those steps of trying to figure out what is in her head. Why did she become a Rotary member to begin with? Does she have this power dynamic to begin with before she entered the club, or doesn't she know what the club is all about, or all that? But at some point, if this is detrimental to the committee that's setting up this event or to the club in general, yeah, you got to do something you have to balance that out versus trying to understand, getting all the empathy in the world you can come up with there versus the club itself.
Yeah, and it might be that you do have to say this isn't a good fit, and do the release thing, that can be the kindest thing that you're doing. It doesn't necessarily feel kind, right? You can't always get a win-win. I understand. I'm not Pollyanna enough to think that you can. And in my world, there are just sometimes a no is a starting place because, okay, now we've got the no, and now what do we need to do next? I would hope that someone could feel empowered to walk alongside somebody like that. I kind of struggle with Joe's, how do I talk to a bully? Because I think that bullies are often the most wounded people. And when we get to the unmet need, they no longer behave like a bully. And so if we could understand what this situation was, if I knew exactly why this person was making a power grab, then maybe I could help them not need to grab that power in that situation. But it's hard to know in a scenario that I'm not connected to do that deep dive. But if you really could unpack what it is, then maybe you could help them. And maybe your Rotary doesn't have the capacity to do that, or they don't have the ability to participate in it. And you have to just let them go. And you need a leader to say, I'm sorry, that's not in the club's best interest. That's not what the club agreed to do. So we're not going to do that. And we can try and help you walk it back. But if we can't, you have the consequence of your behavior sometimes, that you have to live with your decision. Carol, do you want to say something since it's your scenario?
Just really quickly, some of this came to fact after the event was over. All of those conversations would have been really great. The following year, what we did is exactly what a lot of you had said, is we were really clear what the committee was for, what decisions the committee could make, who was responsible for making the final decision. We also asked people to sign up to be a committee chair and get their own committee people together, and they were solely responsible for making the decisions for what that segment of the event that committee was responsible for. So we gave them all the responsibility that they wanted to. We gave them all the latitude. That we would talk to them about, what are your thoughts and things like that. We were empathetic with them. We wanted to be really clear about why they wanted to do certain things. And it went so much smoother the following year because they felt empowered to do that segment, that they had volunteered for.
I really appreciate that follow up and that you learned from the situation and really built on it. I love the idea of forced choice sometimes that looks like, for example, we know that you need to wear clothes. Do you want to wear a shirt or a dress? You get some power in that. You still have to wear clothes. We've set the parameter. We're very clear about that, but you have some choice. For my kids, as a parent, I would say, we're going to wear a sweater today. It's cold outside. Would you like to wear the black one or the green one? And that was their choice. Sometimes your choices are forced. Your creativity or your power comes within your little subset of your committee, not the whole thing or every piece of it. And that might be hard for some people to accept, but it really created structure and was clear. And I think that's the kind piece right there. Does that help?
Mhm.
All right. Well, I sure appreciate you taking time. We are a little bit over, and thank you for doing that. Chris wanted us to weigh in. So if there are topics that you'd like to continue on, you could just put it in the chat. I'll keep the room open for a couple more minutes if people want to stay and visit. But I do think that these are really helpful conversations. Please know that you have so many people who are skilled professionals around mental health and conflict across the board. People could be there to support you through this. If you run into those situations, don't try and navigate things alone. Sometimes it's just good to have somebody to chat to. I sure benefit from it, and I do it for a living. So
Did
thanks,
a nice
folks.
job, Amy. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Amy.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate you.
You
Thank
bet.
you.
Take good care. I'll see some of you in Seattle.
Yeah. Trying to save my chat.
I'm going to download it. Since it's
Okay.
recorded, it should be